Sometimes the most life-changing morning begins with a question no one is willing to answer. Amelia Brooks opened her eyes to the faint sound of rain tapping against tall windows she had never seen before. A soft gray morning filtered through heavy linen curtains, painting quiet patterns across an unfamiliar ceiling crafted from dark oak beams that seemed decades older than the city itself. For several long seconds, she simply stared upward, waiting for recognition to arrive, but none came. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and every thought felt wrapped in thick fog. She pushed herself upright, blinking as the elegant room slowly came into focus. A stone fireplace stood opposite an enormous bed dressed in crisp white linens. A leather armchair rested beside a bookshelf filled with weathered novels. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on the nightstand, their fragrance mixing gently with the comforting scent of cedarwood drifting through the room. Nothing looked threatening. Nothing looked familiar. Amelia glanced down at herself. She was wearing clean cotton sleepwear, several sizes too large, neatly folded rather than hastily thrown on. Her own clothes were nowhere in sight. Confusion settled heavily in her chest as she searched for memories of how she had arrived there. The previous evening existed only in scattered fragments. Rain, bright headlights, a loud horn somewhere in the distance, then darkness. She carefully swung her feet onto the polished hardwood floor, wincing as dizziness briefly overtook her. Beside the bed rested a pair of brand-new slippers positioned neatly, as though someone had expected her to wake at any moment. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, 2 sealed pain relief tablets, and a handwritten note in elegant script. Please do not stand too quickly. The physician expects a full recovery. Breakfast will be ready whenever you feel comfortable. There was no signature. Amelia frowned. Every instinct urged her toward the door. She quietly crossed the room and opened it, revealing a long hallway lined with framed black and white photographs, antique lamps, and polished marble beneath richly woven rugs. Somewhere downstairs, soft piano music drifted through the house alongside the faint aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread. The place felt less like a hospital and more like an old family estate preserved with extraordinary care. As she cautiously descended the sweeping staircase, she noticed several staff members moving calmly through the home. None appeared surprised to see her awake. A middle-aged housekeeper smiled warmly before setting down a silver tray. "Good morning, Miss Brooks. I am glad you are feeling better." Amelia stopped halfway down the staircase. "Where am I?" she asked quietly. The woman hesitated only briefly. "You are safe." "That is not what I asked." Before the housekeeper could answer, a deep, composed voice echoed from the adjoining library. "She deserves the truth." Amelia turned toward the sound. Standing beside a tall window overlooking rain-soaked gardens was a distinguished man with neatly combed silver hair, a charcoal sweater beneath a tailored jacket, and calm blue eyes that revealed years of quiet authority rather than unnecessary intimidation. At 57, Richard Castellano carried himself with effortless confidence, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding without raising his voice. He closed the book resting in his hands and walked forward at an unhurried pace. "My name is Richard Castellano," he said. "2 nights ago, your car left the road during the storm less than a mile from my estate. My security team found you unconscious before emergency responders could reach the area. The physician advised against moving you again after treating your concussion." Amelia searched his face, hoping some forgotten memory would suddenly return. It did not. "Then why can I not remember anything?" Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering carefully. "Because your doctor believes the accident temporarily affected your memory." Silence settled between them. Amelia took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. "Then I should leave." Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "If I believed that was safe, I would already have arranged your transportation. But until the physician completes one more examination this afternoon, I cannot allow you to travel. Your health comes first, even if you disagree with me." Amelia wanted to argue, but the steady ache behind her eyes reminded her that her body was telling a different story than her pride. She followed the housekeeper into a sunlit breakfast room where tall windows overlooked acres of carefully maintained gardens glistening beneath the morning rain. The estate felt impossibly quiet, more like an old countryside manor than the headquarters of a man whose name had appeared countless times in newspaper headlines over the years. A simple breakfast waited on the polished walnut table. Fresh fruit, warm sourdough bread, scrambled eggs, herbal tea, and a small bowl of oatmeal had been arranged with remarkable care. Nothing about the setting felt extravagant. Instead, everything reflected comfort, routine, and unexpected restraint. Amelia slowly sat down, still studying every corner of the room as though another memory might suddenly emerge from behind one of the paintings. The elderly housekeeper introduced herself as Margaret and poured a cup of tea before quietly excusing herself. Moments later, Richard Castellano entered carrying a folded newspaper beneath one arm. He greeted the kitchen staff by name before taking a seat across the table, setting the newspaper aside without opening it. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence felt surprisingly natural rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Amelia looked up. "How long have I been here?" Richard answered without hesitation. 42 hours. She frowned. 42 hours, and no one contacted my family. Richard folded his hands calmly. "We tried." Amelia's heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean you tried?" Richard reached into his jacket and placed her phone carefully on the table between them. The screen was cracked across one corner, but otherwise intact. "It was recovered from your vehicle," he explained. "The battery was damaged in the accident. My staff had it repaired yesterday morning. We found only one emergency contact listed. We called 6 different times." Amelia quickly unlocked the phone using muscle memory that somehow remained despite everything else. She had forgotten. The call history confirmed exactly what he had said. Every outgoing attempt had gone unanswered. A single unread text from 3 weeks earlier remained the most recent conversation. Her expression quietly changed. Richard noticed, but chose not to comment. Instead, he took a sip of coffee before speaking again. "The physician believes your memory will likely return gradually. He advised avoiding unnecessary stress during the first few days." Amelia stared out the rain-covered window. "That is difficult advice to follow when I cannot remember driving here." Richard nodded. "I imagine it is." His answer surprised her. There was no lecture, no attempt to control the conversation, only simple acknowledgement of what she was feeling. Before she could ask another question, the family physician entered carrying a slim leather medical case. Dr. Harold Bennett smiled warmly after completing a careful neurological examination that lasted nearly 30 minutes. He checked her vision, balance, reflexes, and short-term recall before finally closing his notebook with visible satisfaction. "Your recovery is progressing well," he said. "Physically, everything looks encouraging. Memory after a concussion often returns in pieces rather than all at once. You may suddenly remember something completely ordinary before recalling the events surrounding the accident itself." Amelia exhaled slowly. "So, I am not losing my memory forever?" The physician smiled reassuringly. "Nothing I have seen today suggests that." Richard remained silent throughout the examination, speaking only after Dr. Bennett gathered his equipment. "Can she travel?" The physician considered the question carefully. "Short distances tomorrow, perhaps. Long-distance travel should wait another day if possible." Amelia immediately stood. "Then tomorrow I will leave." Richard looked directly at her, neither challenging nor encouraging the decision. "If tomorrow arrives and your physician still believes it is safe, I will personally arrange your transportation anywhere you choose." His answer seemed straightforward, yet something in his measured tone suggested there was still one important piece of the story he had not told her, and for reasons Amelia could not explain, she sensed that whatever remained unspoken had nothing to do with the accident itself. The remainder of the afternoon passed with an almost unsettling calm. Rain continued to fall beyond the tall windows, washing the gardens in silver, while Amelia wandered slowly through the east wing of the estate with Margaret quietly nearby, more as gentle company than supervision. Every room reflected the same careful balance of elegance and restraint. There were no displays of unnecessary luxury, no loud celebrations of wealth, only polished wood, family photographs, shelves lined with worn books, and paintings collected over decades rather than purchased for attention. Amelia found herself unexpectedly drawn to a small music room where sunlight filtered through stained glass onto an old grand piano. She reached toward the keys without thinking. The first few notes emerged hesitantly, then another, then another. Her fingers moved with surprising confidence, even though she could not remember ever learning to play. The melody felt familiar, almost comforting, until a sudden flash crossed her mind. Rain striking a windshield, her hands gripping a steering wheel, a glowing highway exit sign. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only another dull ache behind her eyes. She stepped back from the piano and closed her eyes, trying desperately to hold onto the image before it disappeared completely. "Do not force it," Richard's calm voice came from the doorway. Amelia turned, startled to discover him standing quietly with a leather-bound folder tucked beneath one arm. "Memories rarely return because someone demands them," he said. "They usually arrive when the mind finally feels safe enough to remember." Amelia studied him carefully. "You speak as though you have experienced this before." Richard paused before answering. "Not personally. Someone close to me did many years ago." He offered nothing more, and Amelia sensed he had no intention of expanding unless she asked. Instead, she looked toward the piano again. "I did not know I could play." Richard glanced at the instrument. Margaret said, "You walked directly to it without looking around the room first." Amelia frowned. "Is that important?" "Perhaps," he replied. "Sometimes the body remembers before the mind does." The observation lingered with her long after he left. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the estate library, where towering shelves reached nearly 20 feet toward an intricately carved ceiling. A fire crackled softly despite the mild weather outside, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of cedar. On one table rested several newspapers. Without thinking, Amelia picked up the newest edition. A photograph on the front page immediately caught her attention. Richard Castellano stood outside a community youth center shaking hands with local volunteers after announcing a scholarship program. The article described charitable donations, neighborhood restoration projects, and educational grants. It was a striking contrast to the reputation she vaguely remembered hearing associated with his name years earlier. Richard entered moments later carrying another stack of documents. He noticed the newspaper in her hands, but showed no reaction. "That article surprised you," he observed. Amelia nodded honestly. "I expected something different." Richard smiled faintly. "People often do." Before she could respond, her eyes drifted toward the framed photograph resting on the fireplace mantel. It showed a younger Richard standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a teenage boy whose smile mirrored his own. Dust had not been allowed to gather anywhere else in the room, yet fresh white lilies stood beneath that single photograph. Amelia quietly approached it. "Your family?" she asked. Richard remained silent for several seconds before answering in a voice softer than she had heard before. "My wife and my son." Amelia looked back at him. "Where are they now?" Richard lowered his eyes briefly toward the flowers. "Gone." The single word settled over the room with quiet finality. Amelia instinctively whispered, "I am sorry." Richard gave a grateful nod before turning toward the rain-covered windows. In that moment, Amelia realized the guarded man before her was not simply protecting an injured stranger until she recovered. He was also protecting memories of his own, and somehow she sensed those memories were connected to hers in ways neither of them fully understood yet. That evening, the storm finally moved east, leaving the estate wrapped in the quiet stillness that always followed heavy rain. Fresh air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, while golden light from the setting sun settled across the gardens like a gentle promise. Amelia stood alone on the stone terrace overlooking the reflecting pond, hoping the peaceful view might somehow unlock another missing piece of her memory. Instead, only scattered impressions surfaced. A roadside diner glowing beneath a neon sign, a leather folder resting on the passenger seat of her car, a voice on the phone repeating, "Do not be late." The images disappeared before she could connect them. Frustrated, she closed her eyes and gripped the cool stone railing until the dizziness passed. Behind her, the terrace door opened quietly. Richard stepped outside carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. He placed one beside her without interrupting the silence. They stood together for several moments watching ripples spread across the pond where a pair of swans glided through the fading light. Finally, Amelia spoke. "I keep remembering pieces, but they never stay long enough to make sense." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Fragments often return before the story does." She turned toward him. "You seem remarkably patient for someone whose life has been interrupted by a complete stranger." A faint smile crossed his face. "Patience becomes easier after enough years teach you that forcing answers usually creates more problems than it solves." Before Amelia could respond, Anthony Russo approached from the garden path carrying a sealed envelope. He stopped several feet away, clearly aware that his arrival interrupted a private conversation. "Sir," he said respectfully. The investigators completed their inspection of Miss Brooks's vehicle. Richard accepted the envelope but did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked toward Amelia. "You should hear this yourself." He carefully removed several photographs and a brief report before handing them to her. The first image showed her compact sedan resting beside a rain-soaked embankment with surprisingly little structural damage. The second photograph focused on the front tire, completely flattened by a jagged piece of metal embedded in the rubber. Amelia studied the report, her heartbeat gradually quickening. "This says the tire did not fail naturally," Anthony answered calmly. "According to the investigators, the damage occurred before the vehicle left the road. They cannot determine exactly when, only that it was already losing air before the accident." Amelia slowly lowered the papers. "So I did not simply lose control because of the weather?" Richard met her eyes without hesitation. "It appears the storm made the situation worse, but it may not have been the original cause." The quiet certainty in his voice sent an unexpected chill through her. Another memory flashed across her mind with startling clarity. She remembered stopping at a gas station shortly before sunset. A man wearing a dark baseball cap had approached her car asking for directions. She remembered stepping away for less than a minute while checking a map on her phone. Then the memory vanished again, leaving only the image of unfamiliar hands resting near her front tire. Amelia inhaled sharply. "Someone was near my car." Richard watched her carefully. "You remembered something?" She nodded slowly. "Only a moment. A gas station. Someone asking questions. I cannot see his face." Anthony remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. Richard looked once toward the fading sunlight before speaking with quiet conviction. "Then perhaps your accident was never meant to be an accident at all." The words settled between them like the evening mist gathering over the pond. Amelia looked down at the photographs once more, realizing that the missing hours she feared were no longer the greatest mystery. Somewhere beyond the estate, someone might know exactly why she had been on that road that night. And for the first time since waking in the unfamiliar bedroom, she understood that recovering her memory might not only explain her past. It might also reveal a truth that someone had hoped would never be remembered. The following morning arrived with clear blue skies and the quiet rhythm of birdsong replacing the storm that had lingered over the estate for days. Amelia woke earlier than usual, her mind still circling the investigator's report and the fragmented memory of the man at the gas station. Sleep had offered no answers, only the same scattered images repeating like unfinished scenes from an old film. After dressing in the comfortable clothes Margaret had arranged for her, she stepped into the garden, hoping fresh air might settle the growing questions in her mind. Dew still clung to the rose bushes, and the stone pathways shimmered beneath the soft morning sunlight. Everything around her felt peaceful, almost impossibly so, making the uncertainty inside her stand out even more sharply. She followed a winding trail toward the small greenhouse at the far end of the property, where she found Richard trimming the leaves of a young lemon tree with surprising care. He looked less like the powerful man whose name carried influence across the city and more like someone quietly preserving a tradition that mattered deeply to him. Without looking up, he spoke gently. "Margaret told me you skipped breakfast." Amelia folded her arms. "I was not hungry." Richard set the pruning shears aside. "Or perhaps you have too many questions." She smiled faintly. "That is closer to the truth." He motioned toward a nearby wooden bench overlooking the greenhouse. They sat in comfortable silence until Amelia finally asked the question that had followed her since the previous evening. "If the investigators believe someone tampered with my car, why did you not tell the police immediately?" Richard nodded as though he had expected the question. "They have already been informed. The investigators who examined your vehicle worked directly with the county authorities. Their findings were submitted before sunrise." Amelia studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. "Then why does it feel like everyone knows more than I do?" Richard answered quietly. "Because everyone else remembers the last 2 days. You are trying to solve a puzzle while several important pieces are still missing." Before Amelia could respond, Anthony approached carrying a slim manila folder. "This arrived from the towing company," he explained. They finished cataloging everything recovered from Miss Brooks's vehicle. Richard accepted the folder but handed it directly to Amelia without opening it. "These belong to you." Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cover. Inside were photographs of the personal items recovered from the car along with an inventory list. A leather handbag, a laptop with minor water damage, a travel mug, a notebook. Then her eyes stopped on the final photograph. It showed a sealed manila envelope stamped with the words "confidential" in bold black letters. Amelia frowned. "I do not remember this." Anthony pointed toward the report. "It was found beneath the passenger seat." Amelia stared at the image until another brief memory surfaced. She remembered leaving her office late that afternoon carrying an envelope exactly that size. Someone had called her name across the parking garage. She had turned. Then nothing. The memory dissolved almost instantly, but this time one detail remained. Printed across the corner of the envelope had been the logo of the city planning department where she worked as a senior civil engineer. Amelia looked up in surprise. "I remember my job." The words escaped before she fully realized what they meant. Richard's expression softened. "That is progress." She closed her eyes, concentrating as more fragments slowly connected. Blueprints spread across a conference table. A tense meeting. Someone insisting a document should disappear before morning. Her pulse quickened. She looked back at the photograph of the sealed envelope. Whatever was inside this, someone did not want me to deliver it. Richard remained silent for several seconds before speaking with measured calm. "Then recovering your memory is no longer only about understanding your past. It may explain why fate brought you to my gate on the one night when the storm was strong enough to hide almost everything except the truth that refused to stay buried." The afternoon sunlight stretched across the library floor as Amelia carefully opened the recovered manila envelope for the first time since the accident. Richard, Anthony, and Margaret remained nearby without crowding her, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her. Inside rested several engineering reports, environmental surveys, and a series of signed inspection documents bearing the official seal of the city planning department. At first glance they appeared ordinary, but as Amelia turned each page, more memories quietly returned. She remembered weeks of reviewing construction proposals for a major riverside redevelopment project. She remembered discovering inconsistencies between the approved blueprints and the actual safety reports. Most of all, she remembered refusing to sign the final authorization because the supporting documents did not match the engineering standards required by law. Her breathing slowed as another memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. A senior executive had invited her to a private meeting late one evening, insisting that delaying the project would cost thousands of jobs. When she refused to alter her recommendation, he calmly suggested that some truths were better left unpublished. Amelia lowered the papers and looked toward Richard. "I remember why I was driving that night." Richard remained silent, allowing her to continue in her own time. "I was taking these documents to an independent investigator before the next morning's hearing. Someone inside the project wanted them to disappear." Anthony quietly nodded. "That would explain why the envelope was hidden beneath the passenger seat rather than placed with your other belongings." Amelia closed her eyes again as the final missing pieces settled into place. She remembered leaving her office through the underground parking garage because she believed someone had been watching the building all afternoon. She remembered choosing a different route home after noticing the same dark vehicle several times in her mirrors. She remembered stopping at the gas station during the storm, answering a stranger's request for directions, and returning to her car without noticing anything unusual. Then the tires slowly lost pressure until the rain-covered road became impossible to navigate safely. She looked back at the reports resting in her lap. "The accident erased my memory," she whispered, but it did not erase the truth. Richard walked toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens before speaking in his calm, measured voice. "Truth has a remarkable way of surviving when honest people refuse to abandon it." Amelia studied him carefully. "You could have simply handed these documents to someone else while I was unconscious." Richard turned toward her with quiet sincerity. "They were never mine to deliver." His answer carried more weight than any dramatic promise could have. He had protected not only her life, but also her right to decide what happened next. At that moment, Dr. Bennett entered with the results of Amelia's final examination. After another careful evaluation, he smiled warmly. Your recovery is excellent. I see no medical reason you cannot travel tomorrow, provided someone accompanies you during the first few days. Amelia instinctively looked toward Richard. Before she could speak, he gave a respectful nod. Tomorrow, I will take you wherever you wish to go. There was no attempt to persuade her to stay, no condition attached to his offer, and no expectation of gratitude. For the first time since awakening inside the unfamiliar estate, Amelia realized why his quiet restraint had earned her trust. He had never tried to control her future. He had simply protected her until she was strong enough to choose it for herself. And in doing so, he had restored something far more valuable than her memory. He had restored her confidence that integrity still existed in a world where appearances so often concealed the truth. The next morning dawned clear and cool as Richard's sedan traveled quietly through the city streets toward the county administrative building where the independent investigator had agreed to receive Amelia's documents. The drive passed mostly in silence, not because either of them lacked words, but because both understood the importance of the day ahead. Amelia sat in the passenger seat with the recovered envelope resting securely in her lap. Every page inside represented months of careful work, and now that her memory had returned, she felt the full weight of the responsibility she had almost lost forever. Richard kept his attention on the road, occasionally glancing toward her only to make certain she remained comfortable. He never asked whether she wished to change her mind. He simply honored the decision she had already made. When they arrived, Anthony met them at the entrance after coordinating with local authorities to ensure the meeting remained private. Inside a modest conference room, Amelia personally handed the documents to investigator Daniel Mercer, an experienced public integrity official known for handling sensitive cases with discretion. Mercer carefully reviewed the contents before looking up with quiet respect. Miss Brooks, these records answer several questions our office has been trying to resolve for weeks, he said. Without them, important facts might never have reached us. Amelia felt a quiet sense of relief spread through her. She had not come seeking recognition. She had simply wanted the truth to reach the people responsible for protecting it. Mercer assured her that the documents would be preserved as official evidence, and that every future step would follow the proper legal process. As they left the building, Amelia paused on the courthouse steps and took a long breath of fresh autumn air. For the first time since the accident, the constant pressure inside her chest had begun to fade. Richard stood beside her without speaking until she finally smiled. "It is finished," she said softly. Richard shook his head with gentle understanding. "One chapter is finished. The next one belongs to you." During the drive back to the estate, Amelia found herself remembering smaller details that had nothing to do with investigations or missing memories. She remembered the coffee shop she visited every Friday morning, the elderly neighbor who always watered flowers before sunrise, and the children who waved whenever she crossed the pedestrian bridge near her office. Those ordinary memories felt even more precious than the dramatic ones because they reminded her that her life had not been defined by a single frightening event. When they reached the estate, Margaret greeted them with warm smiles and a homemade apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter. The familiar scent filled the room with unexpected comfort. Amelia laughed quietly for what felt like the first time in days. Richard noticed the change immediately. "Your laughter sounds healthier than any medical report," he said. Amelia smiled gratefully. Perhaps healing begins long before people realize it. That evening, as golden lights settled across the gardens once more, Amelia stood beside the reflecting pond where she had once struggled to remember who she was. This time the silence carried no fear. Richard joined her, hands resting comfortably in his coat pockets. "Tomorrow," Amelia said, looking toward the distant city skyline, "I will return to my apartment and begin rebuilding my normal life." Richard nodded without hesitation. "Then tomorrow you leave knowing you always have friends here." Amelia turned toward him, surprised by the simplicity of his words. There were no promises that stretched beyond reality, no dramatic declarations, only genuine respect earned through honesty and quiet kindness. In that peaceful moment, she realized that the most meaningful connections are often built not through extraordinary speeches, but through consistent acts of integrity performed when no one expects them, and that lesson would remain with her long after every missing memory had finally returned. 3 weeks passed with surprising speed. Amelia gradually returned to the rhythm of her everyday life, reopening the small apartment that had remained untouched since the accident and settling once again into the familiar routines that had once seemed ordinary. Every morning, she walked the same tree-lined streets to the engineering office, greeted the security guard who always smiled before sunrise, and stopped at the neighborhood coffee shop where the owner remembered exactly how she liked her tea. Yet something inside her had quietly changed. She no longer hurried through each day believing every responsibility rested entirely on her shoulders. Surviving the accident had taught her that strength also meant accepting help when life unexpectedly placed kindness in her path. The official investigation into the redevelopment project continued through proper legal channels, and several months later the city announced that the construction plans would undergo a complete independent review before any future approval. Amelia never celebrated the announcement publicly. She simply returned to her desk each morning and continued doing the work she believed was right. One crisp autumn afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived at her office with no return address. Inside rested a single invitation printed on thick, cream-colored paper. The Castellano Foundation would be opening a new community engineering scholarship in memory of Richard's late wife and son, and he hoped Amelia would attend as an honored guest. She stared at the invitation for several moments before smiling softly. It was not an extravagant gesture. It was simply an invitation offered with quiet respect. The following Saturday, Amelia drove back to the estate under bright blue skies instead of heavy rain. Everything looked different now that fear no longer clouded her first impression. Children laughed across the front lawn where local families had gathered for the scholarship ceremony. College students spoke excitedly about future careers in architecture, engineering, and environmental science, while volunteers arranged tables filled with books, maps, and educational displays. The estate no longer felt mysterious. It felt welcoming. Richard greeted every guest personally, shaking hands with students, thanking teachers, and listening patiently to proud parents describing their children's dreams. When he finally reached Amelia, he smiled with the same calm warmth she remembered from the morning she first opened her eyes inside the unfamiliar guest room. "I am glad you came," he said. Amelia looked around at the hundreds of young faces exploring the exhibits. "Now I understand why your foundation matters so much." Richard glanced toward the scholarship banner carrying his family's name. "Pain can either become a wall or a bridge. I chose the bridge." Those simple words stayed with Amelia throughout the afternoon. Before leaving, Richard introduced her to several scholarship recipients, proudly explaining how her dedication to professional integrity had inspired the foundation to include a new award recognizing ethical leadership in engineering. Amelia was genuinely surprised. "I did not do anything extraordinary," she said quietly. Richard shook his head. "Most people believe integrity becomes important during extraordinary moments. The truth is that extraordinary moments simply reveal the integrity someone has practiced every ordinary day before them." As the celebration ended beneath the golden light of late afternoon, Amelia stood once more in the gardens where uncertainty had once overshadowed every thought. This time she carried no unanswered questions, only quiet gratitude. Looking back toward the estate one final time before driving home, she realized that some places become unforgettable not because of the circumstances that first bring people there, but because of the lives they quietly help transform long after the storm has passed. 1 year later, the first spring rain of the season fell gently across the city, but this time Amelia smiled when she heard it tapping against her apartment windows. The sound no longer reminded her of confusion or unanswered questions. Instead, it reminded her that even the darkest nights eventually gave way to clear mornings. Her career had flourished since returning to work. The city planning department had promoted her to lead engineer for several major public safety initiatives, not because she had become famous, but because her colleagues trusted her judgment and unwavering commitment to doing what was right even when it was difficult. The scholarship program established by the Castellano Foundation had already welcomed its second class of students, and several of those young engineers often wrote letters thanking Amelia for encouraging them to place integrity above convenience. She kept every letter neatly organized inside a small wooden box on the bookshelf beside her desk. On a bright Saturday morning, another invitation arrived from Richard. This time, there was no formal ceremony and no public event. The handwritten note simply read, "The roses are blooming again. Margaret insists there is too much pie for one household. We hope you will join us." Amelia laughed softly before placing the note into her purse. Some invitations carried obligations. This one carried only friendship. When she arrived at the estate that afternoon, the gardens were alive with color. The roses lined the stone pathways in full bloom. The fountain reflected the clear blue sky, and familiar faces greeted her with genuine warmth. Margaret welcomed her with a heartfelt embrace before insisting she sample a fresh apple pie still warm from the oven. Anthony smiled as he shared stories about the newest scholarship recipients who had just completed their first year of college. The estate no longer felt like the mysterious place where she had awakened without memories. It had become a place where trust quietly lived. Richard joined her beneath the old oak tree overlooking the reflecting pond, where they had once spoken about broken memories and unanswered questions. For a while, neither of them said anything. They simply watched the afternoon breeze ripple across the water while birds drifted between the branches overhead. Finally, Amelia looked toward him and smiled. "You know, I spent months trying to remember everything I had forgotten." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" She looked across the peaceful garden before answering. "Now I realize the most important part of my life was never what I forgot. It was what I found afterward." Richard's expression softened with quiet understanding. Sometimes people survive difficult seasons believing they lost something beyond repair. He glanced toward the scholarship building standing proudly beyond the gardens. Then one day they discover that compassion, honesty, and hope were waiting on the other side all along. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the estate, Amelia prepared to leave once again. Richard walked with her to the front gate, just as he had done the day she first returned home after recovering. There were no dramatic farewells, only the quiet certainty that genuine respect never required grand promises to endure. Amelia paused before getting into her car and looked back one final time at the place that had changed her life forever. She realized that the greatest gift Richard had ever given her was not shelter during the storm or protection while she healed. It was the freedom to rediscover her own strength without ever asking for anything in return. As she drove away beneath the glowing evening sky, she carried with her a simple truth that would guide every decision for the rest of her life. Character is revealed when kindness expects no reward. Trust is built one honest choice at a time, and the world becomes brighter whenever ordinary people choose integrity over fear. And on that peaceful evening, both of them understood that dignity, once protected, has the remarkable power to change far more than a single life.